All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You guys know how this works by now. You send in the material, and, well, we kind of take a deep dive into it, try to get the most important stuff out of it for you so you can get up to speed really quick.
Yeah, we really try to dig into all the nuances, make the connections, and draw out what's important for you to take away.
Yeah, and today we are going back in time. We're taking a look at the Judges period in ancient Israel. Now, you sent us this really fascinating lesson. It's titled Lesson 37, The Judges, an Era of Spiritual Darkness. So that's what we're going to be basing our conversation on today.
Right. This lesson focuses on the time after Joshua's leadership ended and before Israel became a monarchy. So we're talking about the time when these tribal leaders, these judges, were in charge.
Right, and one of the things that really jumps out from the title itself is this idea of spiritual darkness, right? The lesson even talks about this recurring pattern of sin and deliverance that seems to really mark this whole era. So that's what we want to explore today.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to really unpack what this spiritual darkness really means. You know, what were the specific challenges that the Israelites faced during this Judges period? And how did this cyclical pattern that the lesson talks about, how did that actually play out? So to kind of set the stage, what does the lesson tell us about how things were right after Joshua's time? You know, after he died and that generation kind of moved on.
Well, the source really points to this, really significant change in how the Israelites were led. You know, after Moses and Joshua, there wasn't a strong central figure anymore,
Right.
and that's a big deal. Instead, you had these tribal judges who kind of held power in their own regions,
Yeah.
and it wasn't this unified, consistent leadership that they had before.
So it's almost like things got a lot more fragmented
Yes, exactly.
and less centralized.
Yeah.
And that kind of created more space for problems to arise.
Yeah, the lesson definitely points to that lack of unity as contributing to a lot of the moral and political instability that characterized this period.
Instability, yeah. That's never good. And of course, the lesson doesn't shy away from calling this whole time an era of spiritual darkness.
Right.
So what does the lesson tell us about what that actually looked like? Like, how did that play out in the lives of the Israelites?
Well, it really ties this spiritual darkness to their relationship with God. It introduces this interesting idea. Actually, I found this really thought-provoking, that hate is not the opposite of love.
Okay.
Apathy is...
Apathy, okay.
I'm intrigued. Right. It suggests that love can, turn to hate. But apathy is like a step further, a step removed.
Yeah.
It's like a complete lack of interest or concern. And that's really dangerous, right?
Yeah, yeah. So are they saying that the Israelites didn't necessarily hate God, they just stopped caring?
Yeah, the source implies that this kind of growing indifference, this apathy, was at the heart of their turning away from God.
That's almost scarier in a way.
Right.
Like active rebellion you can kind of understand, but just not caring, that's...
Yeah, it's a departure from that initial zeal and dedication they showed coming out of Egypt.
It's a slow fade.
Right.
Okay, so that's a really interesting way to frame it. Now, the lesson describes this kind of apathy, this drift, as the beginning of a downward spiral. And it points to some specific actions that kind of triggered this whole cycle. What were those initial missteps that set things off in the wrong direction?
Yeah, the lesson really highlights two specific acts of disobedience that are recorded in Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. First, they failed to fully get rid of the people who were already living in the land. They didn't drive them out.
Okay.
And they even made treaties and alliances with them, which they were specifically told not to do.
Right, there was a clear command.
Exactly.
So they disobeyed that.
Right. And then the second thing was they didn't tear down the pagan altars of these inhabitants. They were supposed to destroy these places of worship, but they left them standing.
And we've seen in previous deep dives how important that was to really establish their own faith.
Absolutely. It was about separating themselves from the pagan influences.
Right.
And dedicating themselves to Yahweh.
Okay, so they disobeyed on both counts. What does the lesson say were the consequences of these actions?
Well, there's this really powerful scene where the angel of the Lord appears to the Israelites and delivers this message from God, and it's basically a declaration of judgment. He tells them that because they've disobeyed, these pagan populations are going to become like thorns in their sides.
Thorns! Ouch!
Right, constantly causing them trouble and pain. And he also says that the worship of these pagan gods is going to become a snare to them, like a trap.
A snare, yeah. So it's not going to be easy to get away from these influences.
No, and these images of thorns and snares are very powerful, very visceral.
Very vivid.
Yeah, you can
Yeah.
really feel the pain and the danger that they represent.
Right, so the lesson talks about this angel of the Lord delivering this judgment speech. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what were the main points of the speech?
Sure. The angel starts by reminding the Israelites of all that God had done for them, how he faithfully rescued them from Egypt, brought them to this promised land, and made this covenant with them. Right. But then he basically says, you haven't held up your end of the bargain. You disobeyed my clear instructions regarding these pagan nations and their altars. And the judgment is basically that God's not going to actively fight for them anymore. He's not going to go before them and drive out these nations.
Which leads directly to those thorns and snares, right?
Exactly. They're going to have to face the consequences of their disobedience.
Right. Now, the lesson also brings up an interesting point about the identity of this angel of the Lord, which we've seen before in other deep dives.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the different interpretations that the source presents?
So the lesson points out that in Hebrew, the word for angel simply means messenger.
Yep.
It could be a human messenger, it could be a divine messenger. And it suggests that this could be the same divine messenger that appears in earlier parts of the Bible, like in Genesis 16, for example.
Right.
But it also puts forward this really intriguing idea that this could actually be Yahweh himself acting as his own messenger.
Oh, wow.
And that adds this whole other layer to the story.
That's a lot more significant.
Yeah, it really emphasizes the authority and the gravity of this message. Like, this isn't just an angel speaking on God's behalf. This is God himself showing up and saying, hey, you're messing up.
Wow. Okay. So we've got this initial disobedience, and we've got these really dire consequences that are spelled out. What happens next? Like, what happens after that first generation that lived under Joshua's leadership passes away?
Yeah, this is where things start to really unravel. Judges 2, verses 6 through 10, describes this crucial turning point. It says that after Joshua and all the elders who had actually seen God's mighty works firsthand, after they died, a new generation grew up.
Right.
And this generation, the text says, did not know the Lord or the works that he had done for Israel.
That's kind of sad, isn't it? Like, they've completely lost touch with their history.
Yeah, they've forgotten the foundation of their faith.
Yeah. And this is where the lesson really gets into the sin cycle, that famous pattern that defines the Judges period, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. This is where it all begins. And it's a cycle that repeats itself over and over again for more than 300 years, according to Judges 2.11 and 19.
300 years.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, really. And it all starts with apostasy.
Okay, break that down for us. What does apostasy mean in this context?
Basically, it means turning away from God. So the Israelites, they start abandoning Yahweh and worshiping other gods, specifically the Baals and the Ashtaroth.
Right. The lesson mentions Baal and Ashtaroth.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remind us who these deities were and what their worship involved?
Sure. So Baal was a male god, and he was often associated with specific locations and worshipped in many different cultures in that area. Ashtaroth was a female goddess, the Phoenician name for Ishtar or Astarte in other cultures.
Right.
And she was often called the Queen of Heaven. They were both fertility deities, meaning they were believed to control things like crops and childbirth.
Okay.
And that's why they were so popular. People wanted their favor. But the problem is, their worship often involves some really dark stuff.
Dark in what way?
Well, things like human sacrifice and ritualistic sex. Practices that were completely opposed to the worship of Yahweh.
Yeah. That's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So apostasy, that's the first step in this cycle. What happens next?
The next step is oppression. So as a direct consequence of turning away from God, Yahweh allows these oppressors to come in and attack Israel.
Right.
And these oppressors could be neighboring nations like the Mesopotamians, Moabites, Canaanites, Midianites, Ammonites, Philistines, all these different groups that were constantly vying for power in the region.
It's interesting you said allows these oppressors to come in. So it's not like God's directly sending them. It's more like he's stepping back and letting natural consequences play out.
Yeah, that's how the lesson presents it.
Okay.
Like he's removing his protection.
Makes sense. So the Israelites are being oppressed. What do they do about it?
Well, eventually they reach a breaking point and cry out to the Lord for deliverance. That's the third stage in the cycle.
Okay, so they remember God when things get really bad.
Pretty much, yeah. The lesson even points out that the text doesn't always explicitly say they repent.
Right.
It's more like they're just desperate, and they know who to turn to for help.
Okay, so God hears their cries. What does he do?
He raises up a deliverer, someone we call a judge. And that's the fourth stage.
Okay, so this is where the judges come in.
Exactly.
Now, the lesson mentions that the word judge might be a bit misleading in this context.
Yeah, it's a translation of the Hebrew word shophatim, which actually has more to do with being a military leader or someone who restores order and justice.
Okay.
It's not necessarily about sitting in a courtroom and making legal judgments. It's more about delivering the people from oppression.
So they're not primarily like courtroom judges, they're more like military saviors.
Right. They're chosen and empowered by God to lead Israel in battle.
So that brings us to the fifth stage, victory.
Exactly. And often these judges are empowered by the Spirit of Yahweh,
Right.
which gives them the strength and the wisdom to defeat their enemies.
So the Israelites win. What happens then?
Then there's a period of rest, the sixth stage. During the lifetime of that judge, there's usually peace, and the people, at least outwardly, return to following Yahweh.
But that peace doesn't last forever, right?
Unfortunately, no, and that's the tragedy of the cycle. The final stage is the return to apostasy.
So they fall back into their old ways.
Yeah, after the judge dies, they start worshiping other gods again, and often they become even more corrupt than the previous generation.
So the cycle just keeps repeating, getting worse each time.
Exactly.
The lesson really emphasizes this repetitive nature, right?
Yeah, it specifically refers to Judges 2.1619, and even includes a chart that shows all the different oppressors and the judges who delivered Israel from each one.
It's a pretty bleak picture, isn't it? This constant cycle of sin and deliverance.
It's a reminder that human nature is prone to wander.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the specific judges. The lesson mentions several key figures. Can we go through some of their stories?
Of course.
Like, who are some of the ones that stand out?
Well, there's Othniel. He was the very first judge.
Okay.
And the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he was able to defeat the Mesopotamians and bring a time of rest to Israel.
Okay, so he's a good example of a successful judge.
Yeah, he's kind of the model.
Then there's Ehud. He was pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah, Ehud. He is crafty.
Yeah, he assassinated the Moabite king.
Right, he snuck into the king's palace with a dagger and, well, took care of business.
That took some guts.
It did, and it shows a lot of faith in God. He believed that God would use him to deliver Israel, even in such an unconventional way.
Right, it wasn't a conventional battle.
No, not at all.
And then there's Deborah and Barak. They were a powerful duo.
Yes, Deborah was a prophetess, so she heard directly from God.
Okay.
And she called Barak to lead the army against the Canaanites. And together, through their faith and courage, they achieved a huge victory.
It sounds like Deborah was a real force to be reckoned with.
She was. She was a strong leader.
Okay, so those are some examples of judges who were faithful and effective. But the lesson hints that not all the judges were like that. There were some who were more complicated, right?
Yeah, there were definitely some who made some questionable choices, even though they were chosen by God.
Like who?
Well, there's Gideon, for example. God worked through him in amazing ways. You've probably heard the story of how he defeated the Midianites with just a small band of soldiers.
Right, the famous fleece story?
Exactly. But even though he started out strong, he later made some decisions that weren't so great. Like he made this ephod, this priestly garment, and it ended up becoming an object of idolatry for the people. And he also kind of acted like a king, even though he knew that Yahweh was the true king of Israel.
So even though he was chosen by God, he wasn't perfect.
No one is.
Right. Okay, what about the other judges that the lesson mentions?
Well, there's Jephthah. He was empowered by the Spirit of Yahweh to defeat the Ammonites, but he's most remembered for this rash vow he made, which led him to sacrifice his own daughter.
Oh, wow. That's a tragic story.
It is, and it shows that even though he had God's Spirit, he still made terrible mistakes. And his leadership didn't ultimately bring lasting peace to Israel.
And then there's Samson, the strongest man in the Bible.
Right, Samson. He was given incredible strength by the Spirit of Yahweh to fight against the Philistines. But he was also really driven by his own desires.
Right, he had a weakness for women.
He did, and that ultimately led to his downfall. And because he was so focused on his own passions, he never really managed to unite Israel or bring them lasting deliverance.
So we see a real mix of judges, some who were faithful to God, some who were not. What's the takeaway from all of this? Like, what's the lesson trying to tell us about this whole period?
Well, one of the things the lesson points out is that the experiences of the judges, both the good and the bad, really foreshadowed what Israel needed in a leader.
Good.
It showed them what qualities were essential in a king and what qualities were detrimental.
Right, like they needed someone who was strong and courageous, but also humble and obedient to God. Okay, now we talked a lot about the Spirit of Yahweh. The lesson spends some time unpacking that concept. Can you summarize what it says about that?
Sure. The lesson explains that the Spirit of Yahweh isn't just God's presence in a general sense. It's more like this specific and active aspect of God that empowers individuals to do extraordinary things.
Okay.
Like, it empowered the judges to lead the armies. It empowered the 70 elders under Moses to help him govern the people. It's like this divine enablement, this extra boost of strength and wisdom that God gives to certain people for specific tasks.
So it's not just about their own natural abilities, it's about God working through them.
Exactly. The Hebrew verbs used in the text, they suggest that the Spirit kind of clothed or came upon these individuals. It's like God was putting on them a special garment, equipping them for the task at hand.
That's a cool image. So the Spirit of Yahweh was a key part of the judges' success.
Yeah, it was the source of their power.
Okay. Now, as we come to the end of our deep dive here, the lesson highlights one particular verse that really seems to sum up the whole judges period.
Yes, Judges 21.25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It was, and that's exactly what the book of Judges describes, this kind of societal breakdown, this lack of unity and shared values, because everyone was doing their own thing.
Yeah, no one was really in charge. And the lesson also mentions this term, Canaanization of Israel. What does that mean?
That refers to how the Israelites started to adopt the practices and beliefs of the Canaanites, the people who were already living in the land.
Okay.
Remember, they were told to drive them out, but they didn't, and they ended up being influenced by their culture.
Right, those thorns and snares.
Exactly. So over time, the Israelites started worshiping the Canaanite gods. They started adopting their customs. They even started intermarrying with them.
So they were slowly losing their own identity, their own distinct faith and way of life.
Yeah, they were being assimilated into the surrounding culture.
And that made them even more vulnerable to the cycle of sin and oppression.
Right. Absolutely.
So to kind of bring it all together, the Judges period was this really turbulent time, right? Marked by this recurring cycle of apostasy, oppression, deliverance, and then back to apostasy again. And all of this was happening because the Israelites kept turning away from God. They kept getting entangled in the ways of the Canaanites, and they didn't have that strong central leadership to guide them.
Yeah, that's a great summary.
And this went on for over 300 years, right?
That's what the lesson says.
So it must have had a huge impact on them.
Oh, definitely. It shaped their whole history.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder of how important it is to stay true to your values, to remember your history, and to have good leadership. Because when those things are missing, well, things can fall apart pretty quickly.
That's the lesson of the Judges.
And it's a lesson that's still relevant today, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, we see these same patterns playing out in our own world, in our own societies, even in our own lives. The temptation to compromise our values, the danger of getting caught up in the wrong crowd, the consequences of poor leadership. These are all things that we still struggle with today.
And it's so easy to get sucked into those cycles, just like the Israelites did.
Right. It takes a real conscious effort to break free.
It does.
So for you, our listener, think about what snares and thorns might be present in your own life, in your own context. What are the things that could lead you down that path of spiritual or moral compromise? And what can you learn from the Israelites' mistakes so that you can avoid falling into those same traps? What kind of leadership do you need in your life, and where can you find it? These are all questions that the Judges period forces us to confront.
Yeah, it's a powerful challenge.
It is. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Judges period. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit challenging. Take some time to reflect on what you've heard and see how it applies to your own life. And until next time, keep digging.
Come
diving.
Exactly. See you later.